Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. It's a little bit of a follow-on again from the sort of previous lessons. Today we're looking at blocking in shadow shapes on figure drawings. So last week we articulated the outside contour of our figure drawing, and the week before that we were looking at gestures, so basically the initial sort of structure to start laying our contour over. And the week before that we looked at using basic lines, or learning about basic lines that form the basis for these sorts of drawings. So last week we ended up with a fairly simple line drawing that's reasonably accurate, captures all the major forms of the body. This week we're going to turn it into basically lay the foundation for turning it into a fully rendered drawing. And that requires us to figure out where shadow shapes are and where light shapes are. In this instance it's pretty straightforward because we've got a single light source hitting the figure, coming from the top right corner, sort of coming that direction. And it's creating an interesting set of shadows. It's reasonably complex because he's a tattooed figure. But we'll be ignoring the tattoos for the time being. It may be something you'd add later. It's sort of an interesting element for the figure drawing. But for the time being, we're just looking at the shadows that actually exist because of the forms, not anything to do with the tattoo on the figure. But it potentially could make some aspects a little bit complicated, but it makes for a good exercise. So the way that he's sort of lit slightly, sort of maybe either kind of perpendicular to our gaze as the viewer or slightly behind the figure relative to us, which means we get quite a lot of shadow on the front of the figure. You can see there are some interesting cast shadows, so this arm is casting a shadow down that leg. There's a little bit of a shadow cast here as well, casting a shadow across there, sort of across the thigh from that left hand arm. So these are called cast shadows. If you've seen my introduction to form, I can't quite remember what that's called, that video, but essentially it's a video that has a sphere that looks at each different aspect of a form, the difference between a cast shadow and a form shadow. So just to reiterate, the form shadow is the shadow that exists, say, along this arm. This shadow exists just because there's a stronger light source on this right hand side than there is on the left hand side, and it's creating a line basically along the arm that delineates what's in light, which is on the right hand side, and what's in shadow on the left hand side. That's a form shadow, so it just occurs exclusively on the form just because that's the way light is hitting it. Imagine it like the moon. The moon obviously is illuminated from different angles by the sun, and it creates a different shape on the moon in terms of either being a crescent moon or a half moon or a full moon. That's a form shadow on the moon. Nothing is casting a shadow on the moon. If you have an eclipse, then there's a shadow cast by the Earth on the moon, and that's a cast shadow. So basically the moon is blocking the Earth. The Earth is blocking the moon from the sun, so we see it as a shadow. That's the kind of shadow that occurs here. So this is a shadow cast on the leg because something is blocking the light from hitting it, which is this arm across here, I think. It's also casting a slight shadow up the inside arm on the left hand side as well. So that's just a quick overview of the difference between a cast shadow and a form shadow. I'll point out which is which as we're working, just to kind of keep your mind thinking about that. But to begin with, we're going to start thinking about how the external contour that we looked at last week, so these little overlaps and these forms on the outside, how they relate to the inside, or the internal forms essentially, so the forms that occur within the figure. So we can see what's going on in terms of what the form is from the outside contour, so we know what shape this leg is, but we don't know exactly how much it bulges, whether it's flat, whether it's very round, whether it's got lots of forms within it. We start to find that out once we lay the shapes into the figure. But the shapes inside the figure will generally relate to the shapes outside, the sort of forms outside the contour that we've created. So for instance, this overlap that we noted last week, where the knee joint kind of drops down into the shin bone, creates a fairly distinct shadow shape. And this happens quite a lot in human figures. So that's an instance of our line drawing, which looked at the outside form, interacting with the form on the inside, which is this shin bone in shadow. While we're putting in our shapes, we're going to be looking for negative shapes and positive shapes, which I think is covered. I'm not certain if it's been covered yet on YouTube. Certainly there's one on the OCAD course. But basically the difference in a negative shape and a positive shape is, say within the context of this figure, this is a negative shape that sits within the whole form. So this little kind of trapezoid thing, that's a negative shape. So the whole figure is a positive shape, but then on the figure itself, we could start to look at, say, this light shape being a positive shape and then a negative shape that surrounds it, or vice versa. But we're basically seeing them as two distinct shapes, and that's where we start to find our shadow shapes. So to demonstrate, I'll begin by blocking in, start with something quite simple, quite clear. I'll block in the shadow shapes on the shin bone leading up to the knee. Actually, I'll just begin with, there's this nice cast shadow that we were talking about. Which kind of ends about there. It becomes something of a halftone. So it's fairly straightforward, this portion of the drawing, but basically what you're spending a lot of time doing is determining where your shadow shapes end and your halftones begin. So if you've seen my lesson about form, you'll understand the difference between a halftone and a shadow shape, hopefully. But essentially that's what we're doing. We're just going through the figure, keeping our lines simple again. So I've not made a curve, I've tried to block this into straight lines. I'm going to shade the shapes in as I go. You can actually place all the shapes then shade in, but in this instance, just to make it clearer for you guys, I'm going to do it on the fly. I'll also separate, there's a very dark shape in here, this sort of portion of the drawing that's just receiving no light whatsoever. So I might darken that slightly as well, just to keep it distinct. Now the box is entirely in shadow pretty much, so we can go ahead and block that in with the leg, and it'll mean we actually lose a lot of this distinction between the lower leg and the box, which is fine for the time being. So I'm looking at this sort of positive shape of the light dropping down into the shin. And there's just this bit of halftone, so this is an instance where it's difficult to exactly determine where the shadow begins and where the halftone ends. So I'm just using straight construction lines like we did last week, just to keep things simple as I'm blocking them in. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on in this knee, so I don't want to omit any significant little articulations. It's kind of a little bit knobbly, and there's not loads of knobbly aspects on this figure, so it's good to kind of grab hold of any bone, any little bones that stick up, because they're nice little anchor points for us. So then there's this kind of dipped in, quite strong shadow shape that sort of sits by itself just over the top of the knee, and then another fairly dark halftone, but nonetheless a halftone that kind of cuts back here. So this whole process is just a case of trying to divide light from dark, essentially, which sounds pretty dramatic. So here we've got this foot emerging back into light. So go ahead and try and get as much of it in as possible. So I'm looking backwards and forwards a lot. It's important as you work to observe your reference, whether you're working from life or from a photo like this. So something like that's probably sufficient for that foot. I think it also drops out into a shadow by the looks of it. So if I start to block that in, just using a single sort of consistent tone for blocking in my shadows. For the time being, we're not going to kind of add any variation within them. You might find it naturally happens, but it's not necessary to do so. Oh, as I said, so I'm going to, at the same time, block in some of these other shadows. So I may as well go ahead and just get this hand figured out at the same time. It's mostly in shadow the hand, so I'm going to join it to the box as well. At the same time, I might go across here. This is one of those instances I was talking about where the leg has some tattoos on it, so I'm just trying not to get too distracted by those while I figure out. Again, there's kind of these little articulations within the knee joint, which makes for a reasonably complex, some reasonably complex shapes. Needs to come up a little bit higher there. So I'm not measuring. The rest of this portion of our exercises I've actually measured quite a lot, but by this point your shapes become so small it's not necessarily required to measure. One thing I'm going to do, and make a little bit of a executive decision, is actually maybe, no, there is this bit of light that drops. I was trying to decide whether to make it into a kind of highlight, but I think it's maybe just some light creeping around from behind the figure. This very sort of strong highlight on the left hand side. So I'll drop it down to there. Come back here. So you'll notice I began here with this leg, but I've made my way all the way around to the other leg. You'll find because shadows interconnect, sometimes you just have to kind of keep going with them to a certain extent. As I said, this is probably actually more than the usual sort of way I'd work, so I'd actually keep going around, block all my shadows in before, or sort of sketch them in this way as sort of line drawings before doing anything else. I was going to try not to do that just because it would make it a bit clearer, but I think for the sake of you seeing how everything connects, it's better to create whatever sort of continuous shadow shape is required to connect all the forms together. Again, you get this sort of talking about lost and found edges. the value here where the sort of bedbug line on the lower part of the thigh connects to the shadow on the hand is pretty much the same. I'm not quite sure if this is a light or what, but I'll treat it like a light. Maybe I won't actually. Maybe I'll just leave that shadow. There's basically this strong light here, but I think that's possibly, there's maybe a secondary light source in the photograph that I'm going to try to ignore. You'll probably, if you work a lot from references online, you'll find photographs tend to use quite strong secondary light sources, which isn't always ideal for this sort of figure drawing or this sort of naturalistic drawing. This little shape here is an example of the outside form working with the internal form. So this shape exists because there's this portion of the latissimus dorsi at the back that kind of reaches over. You just sort of see bulging out a bit. It's very bleached out in my photograph, but you can kind of see it subtly cutting back in. So this basically creates one form within the figure. Equally, there's this other form here that's sort of more of a love handle probably than a muscle, which juts out just there. So that also connects to the external portion of that form. So you start to see how the inside and the outside work together, or you have to be aware of both as you're drawing in order to make them make sense. Before jumping into the top part of the figure, I'm going to stop blocking in these shadows for the time being, and I'm going to shade some of them in just so we can sort of see these lightly plotted shapes and how they work. Something like that. So you can see it's a reasonably complex set of interlinking shapes, but you'll find the more you practice this sort of thing, the easier it becomes to create these sorts of shadow maps. Particularly, as I say, because the distances between these shapes are so small, just because you're kind of just working within this figure, that you don't have to worry so much about using your eye compared to measuring like you did early on. Oh yeah, and I'll just go down from this arm down into the box. So as I say, I'm not too concerned about losing the edge of that leg into that shadow. We'll probably find it again later in the drawing. But these sorts of lost edges, so portions where the shadow sort of just melds into or one shadow shape on one form melds into another shadow shape on another form. They're fine to lose them because it's actually quite naturalistic. People have a tendency to kind of overemphasize the difference in value between things because they feel like they have to make it clear exactly where say the body ends and where the box begins, because they're separate things. But it can be nice sometimes to leave those sorts of matching values as you work, because as I say, it does enhance the realism, and it's something that we'll see a bit in later later projects or later versions of this drawing, as we start to kind of find and lose it again. Yeah, so that pretty much does it for mapping out the bottom portion of the bottom portion of the drawing, which includes these legs and that arm. Again, I'm going to, for the time being, ignore, there is this very strong light that's hitting the left-hand side of the figure. I'm going to ignore that. It might be something we could include later as a kind of strengthened highlight, but for the time being, I'm going to ignore it and just focus on this right-hand light source. Which, if you were working on the piece yourself, is something I'd recommend. So if we start to move up the sort of upper portion of the torso into the deltoid, the deltoid's this kind of form here. So if we start to think about it in anatomical terms, we have a deltoid muscle that's a single form. This is our bicep and then tricep. Got our forearm down here, same on that side. The rib cage is sort of crumpled down into the waist, and then we've got our pectorals and the muscles over the shoulder connecting to the bicep, to the deltoid. So we want to try to get this shadow shape to follow the form of the deltoid, kind of just sitting slightly above the bicep, and then cuts back out itself. It kind of runs on this sort of angle, which gives an indication for where the light source is coming from. Then it kind of loops back up because it's almost connecting to that form. Then again runs over into the neck, kind of blocks down here somewhere. Then we've got the guy's face, which we'll just kind of simply block in, connecting to this beard, which we'll treat as a shadow because it's quite a dark value. Then we've got this little cut back here that kind of shows us through that edge of the shadow where this kind of cleft between the between the pectorals are. Then again, a kind of sliding shadow shape that drops down to about here, and finally goes something like that. So if we connect all these together, which we can now, actually I might just, his nose is poking out ever so slightly, so I might get that. So connect all these together. Might go there actually and find another little bit of light just hitting there. and you can see this very sharp, very clear shadow shape that follows a vein. You'll find shadow shapes that fall on veins are always really crisp because the light basically just gets completely cut off there. Where some forms that are kind of, say this bicep, sort of this upper arm here is kind of rounded, you get these kind of gradual tones. In this portion where it cuts against the vein, it's really strong, a really sharp line, so nice and easy to see where the shadow shape is there. So it looks like kind of angles back in. Then we've got this kind of paddy bit of the hand, curving back again, cutting in here between two knuckles. Just there as well. As I say, I'm going to ignore all those lights, so I'm actually going to just try to follow these shapes on his hair. So yeah, there might be a little bit of light catching on that side where he's got a part, but otherwise all of this would connect together. We've got that portion of his hair, which we're going to treat, I think we'll treat as a half tone. Got this cleft between the fingers which has a shadow, and then there's another little bit here. Fingers are something that if we carry on with this one we'll have to kind of go back and address because I haven't actually done them in much detail at all. There's almost a little shadow shape there that connects that portion of his face, creates a kind of slightly nice chiseled look. And then block that in just as a back shape. Try to find somewhere for this little shape cast by the ear, which is just about sufficient, and then maybe the inside of the ear while we're at it. And that pretty much does it for blocking in these shadow shapes. So that's how quickly you can do this aspect of the drawing. It's just a case, the main difficult aspect is figuring out what's a light and what's a shadow. So that's something you're going to have to spend quite a long time pondering as you work on your own. Particularly if you have complex light sources like this. It's a bit more straightforward if you're working from an academic drawing or something like that that has quite nice light sources already figured out for you. Probably didn't really want to do that actually to that foot. I'm actually not entirely happy with that lower line of the foot, so I'm just going to, for the time being, merge it into the shadow. Which, to be honest, probably shouldn't be there either, because that's actually from that left-hand light source that I've ignored. So I might go back to the line. See, there's always a little bit of push and pull when you're kind of figuring out drawings like this. But that's basically the idea. You're trying to figure out what's a light shape, what's a dark shape. You'll find that shapes, when I kind of just did an outline, they will sometimes look a bit different in size, so your measurements might seem a little bit off or something like that when you first start to block the lines in, but when you fill them in they look alright, and you'll find that a filled in shape tends to look a bit smaller because it becomes this kind of even dark shape surrounded by light shapes, or one large light shape, shall we say. But yeah, that's pretty much it. This then gives us a platform to work from, so we could go in and start finding variations in the shadows. We could start blocking in halftones. While you're doing this, you can start to kind of look and think about how different forms connect. So you can kind of see this form here kind of sits over the top, so you've got those halftones emerging. As I was saying earlier, these ones definitely connect. There's like another little shape in there as well, but it's not actually got a shadow. There's a lot going on the top of this shoulder that we see kind of projecting forward. As I say, you can start to see kind of aspects of the face and the way it's lit coming through just from those simple shadow shapes. You can use it as an opportunity to kind of go back and revisit your contour as well, so if there's certain things you want to make more angular, you can do. If you make things more rounded, you can also do that. So you're just kind of searching around a lot, trying to figure out exactly how you want this figure to look. And then as it develops, you will look at this next week probably, but you basically start to add variations within the shadows. So you start to even out your shadow tones. You can start to block in areas of half tone. So parts of the figure that are catching a lot less light, start to block them in at the same time. Looking at how the forms connect again. So everything's always sort of connecting. Your overall sort of outside gesture that you initially draw creates the foundation for your contour, and then these shadow shapes fill the contour. But all the time, all the while you're doing it, you're trying to kind of think of the general flow of forms and how they connect to each other and how that ultimately expresses some sort of character in the image. But yeah, that pretty much does it for this week. Hopefully it was interesting. It kind of follows on from a few other exercises we've done, but I thought it was worthwhile doing it, kind of following through with this idea of messing around with figure drawings and giving you guys a kind of basis to work from if you go to life drawing classes, which I know a lot of you do. But yeah, hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you guys next week.